Is it running off a DVI? Or where's it?
Hi everyone. We made it. A whole day. No one, did anyone die?
Recorded 4 hours 5 minutes.
Oh yeah, oh geez.
And this session
Let's
will
all
be
be
2
the
hours
best.
30 minutes.
Yeah, we should be okay.
There are no breaks here. You're not going to go hungry. Well done, everyone, for making it this far. Before I introduce... Did you all just applaud yourselves? Well done, well done. Before I introduce our first international speaker for Freeplay 2010, we have a couple of giveaways. The first one will be for the person who's currently in the lead on Backchatter. And then we also have for people who filled in the feedback form. So apparently, the person who's winning on Backchatter is D. Yoshi. They're here. Hey!
Awesome! I didn't have once. I forgot about it.
Congratulations. And the second prize that we have, because for coming along and supporting yourselves, it's based on the feedback forms. I'm going to invite Brandon to come up and be the glamorous assistant. And just pick it. That's why we flew all the way here to pick a name out of a box. James Dominguez? Cool. That'd be awesome. Done. There'll be other giveaways tomorrow, so if you haven't been playing Backchatter, you should play it. And if you haven't been filling out feedback forms with your name so we know who you are, you should be doing that as well. Sorry? It is a bit late, apparently. This is Brandon. We're very excited. We're very excited that he agreed to come out and talk at Freeplay. But part of me wants to read his bio, and then part of me thinks that this does enough to sort of position who he is. Brandon is currently the chairman of the IGF, which runs as part of GDC. Yep, which runs as part of GDC. And he very graciously agreed to come out and give our first keynote. So please welcome him.
So for those that don't know, but you just kind of heard that, I'm Brandon. I used to write for Gamma Sutra and Edge, and then I founded the website Offworld, and a couple of months ago I was named chairman of the IGF. And I should say up front that I've never tried to give a talk this long before, so if I end up blowing through the whole thing in 10 minutes, we can talk about anything you want to talk about, or listen to some CDs or something. So before I headed out here to Freeplay, I struggled a bit with what to call and how to describe this talk before simply settling on "all play is personal," which is a pretty severe bastardization of this semi-well-known phrase from American politics. But after I'd done so, it turned out that maybe it was a little more fortuitously chosen than I would have imagined. Because there's some synchronicity here with what our Freeplay director Paul talked about in a recent interview to describe the mission and the makeup of the conference itself. And as a side note, that's actually where my keynote description came from, and probably why it sounded a lot smarter than anything I would have done myself. But so the reason I say I had trouble coming up with how best to summarize what I'm going to talk about today goes beyond simply titles and text, because I've honestly got what I think may be a pretty big problem. My problem is that I'm completely trapped inside my own head. And I'm not quite sure if this is a problem that pretty much everyone else suffers. That is, funnily enough, one of the symptoms. But all of my perspectives seem utterly obvious. As in, of course we're in the midst of one of the most exciting revolutions in culture and entertainment. And of course video games are the new front line of artistic expression and have infinite potential to take us somewhere entirely new. So if anything I say here today seems resoundingly obvious, it's only because I can never truly tell if my perspective really is that unique, or how many other people approach things the same way I do. And that goes even though I'm still surprised and disappointed daily by people held in some regard who really should totally know better or care more, who just completely aren't riding the same wavelength. But either way, you may also be wondering why I'm here in front of you right now, and I admittedly sometimes have to keep reminding myself of the same thing when I stand before crowds like this, especially when I've never actually made a game. That's not strictly true. I put in more than my fair share of time in the early 90s with Tim Sweeney's ASCII adventure platform ZZT, creating super banal horror games about haunted hotels and naive adventures through inner-city crack house slums, populated by characters that spoke only in Dead Milkman lyrics. And in college, I actually partnered with some computer science students for a course on creating a PC game, which was terrible and entirely underdesigned, though to her credit, it was the only game that scoped itself well enough to be playable by the end of the semester. And after college, in my former life as a Flash and multimedia developer, I did some characters and design for a simple, like, Scorched Earth type snowball fight game. And my hard drive is still littered with quarter-finished prototypes like this Bubble Ghost clone, but I wouldn't really equate any of those things to what most of you have done. Probably more relevant, though, is that I have lived the life of an indie. I know that deep, hollow, wolf-at-the-door gnawing feeling from freelancing and never knowing where my next check was coming from, a time where I was deeply depressed and keeping myself sane only by pirating episodes of SpongeBob SquarePants and eating cheap frozen hamburgers. And that's something I went through for over a year until I finally found steady, secure work at a studio, creating the first online training prototypes for McDonald's, only to be told shortly before Christmas that we'd have to start working mandatory 12-hour days and come in on weekends, and a job that I was promptly let go of after the project finished. And so years later in that same career, I had to deal with that abject leap of faith terror when I got the opportunity to leave the salaryman workaday life and start working for myself in an entirely new industry, not having the slightest clue if I could survive even for the next 6 months. But I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself here because I'd like to come back to that career path later and start back a little bit further. And actually, since I've got something like an hour here, which is almost 3 entire episodes of a TV show minus the commercials, I'd like to go back even further to here. But really, I want to start just a little bit after there and explain a bit more about how I got to where I am right now, and in particular, why it all rests on me giving up on games. So, I'm pretty sure there are very few people in here right now, people that have a super vested interest in the future of games, that won't find this familiar, that feeling that life fully started when our parents brought home our first computer. For me, it was my dad bringing home our TI, where the next few years played out a lot like you see here, me hacking away at BASIC and trying to get a feel for the possibilities this thing could provide. Almost all of my early memories from here on out revolve around computers and arcades and video games, summed up best by my second grade class photo, which my parents were horrified to learn was taken the day they let me go into school wearing this ratty t-shirt. But it's an image that pretty much continues to sum me up best. Just add a little more scruff, and I'm basically the exact same person now that I was then. But my memories of games aren't all quite as fuzzy and warm. Even a few years later, games were still my primary way of relating to my peers. And I've got a very specific memory of going on a bowling night outing with a bunch of classmates where I had absolutely zero interest in the actual act of bowling, but had an amazing round of food fight in the Alley's arcade, which a bunch of the girls in class saw and seemed genuinely impressed by, so much so that it added a huge amount of stress to my Christmas list that year. Choose Nintendo or go with the flagging Atari 7800, which, if nothing else, would let me play Food Fight at home and hold on to that brief moment of triumph just a little bit longer. But nothing really typifies the worst of my gaming past than this right here, this girl. One of the Food Fight onlookers in our classes like alpha female. All through my childhood, we moved essentially every 2 years, and I was never really allowed to fully rise in social ranks, and was always kind of the weird outsider, certainly never able to have the mobility to be seen in public with the class's alpha girl. And bear in mind, too, that I wasn't necessarily the boy most likely to back then. I was as awkward and shy as you might expect, but still, somehow I used to finagle my way over to the girl's house on a pretty regular basis, totally unsupervised. The hitch was that once I got there, I didn't have a clue on earth what you were supposed to do with a girl totally unsupervised, so I did what came natural. I asked if we could play video games. And again, still have super sharp memories of exactly which games we spent our time playing. But so here I actually thought we had something kind of going, these regular play dates, until one day, again, a day forever burned into my brain. A friend asked if the two of us could come over to her house, to which she replied, "You can come over, but tell Brandon to stay home. I don't want to play video games." So this, granted, should have probably put me off games entirely sooner. It should have showed me that I was in the midst of a socially unacceptable habit, and it did, more or less, once we moved again. By then, as I started into my early teens, my interests started to radically diversify. I made my first forays into the art underground when I discovered culture hackers like the Church of the Subgenius, and would go on to discover David Lynch and dig deeper into foreign film. But above all, I discovered music. Specifically, I made a fateful, life-changing discovery of a super low circulation magazine called Chemical Imbalance, bought only because it came with this record here, which just happened to contain a song by the still entirely unknown California band called Pavement, and covered these other bands called Superchunk and Unrest that had just popped up and were meant to be something special. And while it's not totally important that those names mean anything to you, it was massive for me to discover that there was something happening out there under the shiny veneer of the major magazines and MTV, this underground network of tiny record labels operating out of their living rooms. And so I gave up on games. I gave up on games and sent away for every Xerox record label catalog I could find and started obsessively piecing together that underground network by hand, basically building my own paper and text file encyclopedia before the browser-based internet existed. And all of that digging eventually turned up another invaluable gem. This right here, my now warped and dog-eared copy of the Mechanic's Guide, which was a booklet put together by a little indie label from Arlington, Virginia called Simple Machines, which led you step by step through all the processes of how to manufacture and distribute your own records. And so it was that at 18, I decided this is what I needed to do, which I then did. And over the next few years, I put out a few different records by 3 of my favorite bands at the time and published a soundtrack record for a children's book by one of my favorite illustrators. But the most striking impact this experience had came from that first Band 2 single I released, Poopy Head. Some friends that were living in Austin at the time. A group of us had driven down to stay with them, and Dean from Poopy Head had something he wanted us to try. It turns out he just imported this new console called a PlayStation from Japan, along with a few games, only one of which he really thought we truly dig. And that was that. Come full circle, Masaya Matsuro and Rodney Greenblatt had blown the lid off with a game that definitely mixed music with an entirely untraditional and left-field approach to art and character design with Parappa the Rapper. And if this is what I could now expect from video games, I knew I desperately wanted to be part of it again. And it turned out that while I was away, my longtime dirtiest gaming secret is that I basically opted out of the entire 16-bit and early Windows era. A whole new generation of artists had started breaking into multimedia and games, which fully rekindled my flame and set me down that career path to entering multimedia development myself. And while that career path never quite panned out the way it wanted to, and I ended up a broken salary man working mandatory 12-hour days, eventually my nights and weekends passion for keeping close tabs on the gaming underground got me rescued from my rat race cubicle drone life, and I was offered a freelancing gig to write for Edge, a magazine I'd only discovered some 6 or 8 months prior, which itself was another fateful, life-changing discovery, because it was the first time I'd found people willing to talk about the present and future of games as an adult, something I wouldn't be ashamed to read on the train or indeed in front of girls. And so here's where things get interesting. So I think by 2010, we've already sort of moved on from that games are in their infancy trope. We've begun to fully understand what it means that games and play have been a part of culture since before culture began, something Adam will be talking about at much greater length tomorrow. And by that same token, we should understand that indie, as it relates to games, now as catchy a marketing slogan as it is, isn't exactly in its infancy either. We can look at back-home icons like Richard Garriott, right at the dawn of computer games, building his empire starting as a teenager, one self-sealed Ziploc bag at a time. And we can look at people like the young Eric Chahi, creating nearly the entirety of another world basically by himself. Our history books are littered with these people who, by themselves, essentially built video games into the massive industry they are today. The obvious and key difference, though, was that the auteurs who created these masterworks, our original indie ancestors, didn't control the means of distribution. They were entirely and forever beholden to the network of publishers and distributors that could keep their games in the retail channel. And so I've been doing a lot of thinking lately about when and where, by contrast, the indie games movement as we know it today actually began. And I think I've boiled it down to a single moment in 2006, a moment that I was lucky enough to witness at the first game developer conference I attended with Edge. So Darwinia had just won the Independent Games Festival's grand prize, and Introversion's Mark Morris had just taken the stage to give their acceptance speech. And